And now, leaving off with Gebser in the second half of the ever-present origin, I want to detail the integral and the fourth dimension, where Einstein introduces time to the spatial temporal, and this is an added dimension and really returns and calls back to that holistic and original archaic structure. And the sphere, however, differs, that all the knowledge obtained with the prior structures, the mythic, the magical, and even the rational, can now be woven in a sort of way that creates a sort of awareness from the knowledge that we've obtained. There's a sort of Hegelian kind of callback, I would say, to some degree, to meandering and the history as it unfolds for us. And so the realm of the integral and all of that knowledge is really towards space being put back together with time in the integral that will bring balance. And so the masculine, such as the mythic ode to the matriarchy, and the rational of the patriarchy, the integral will also bring a wholeness back to the conscious and the unconscious. There's a couple notes about Freud and Jung that I think could be helpful with how the rational really interacts with the other structures before it. And so Jung and Freud rediscover the mythic structure, but it's in the point of view of a sterilization, where the emotional states and the reductionary of a dialogue of the unconscious and the conscious is far too simplistic, whereas the psyche, at least what Gebser might suggest, is way more in the sort of rhizomatic way that we've been discussing on the channel in recent months. And so the unconscious for Jung and its connection to the collective is more of a sort of plateau, if you'd like, going down to the archaic in a sort of layering, as opposed to the rational way we might consider dualisms and propositions as such. And so each structure in the integral becomes aware of these different structures and instrumentalizes them, and their own limitations can be set. And so that's just kind of a precursor really to how the integral stage could be described as. But as for the chapters themselves, I want to resume with 4 here, which is the mutations as an integral phenomenon and intermediate summary. And so he has these interesting diagram of these geometric signs that he gives to each structure. Magical is point-like or a cavern, which contrasts the labyrinth and cavern. The cave is spatially undirected, so there's no real direction, no sense of itself, where the labyrinth, of course, has a direction. It's trying to find its way and through the corridor to find the light with the myths, such as with the early Greeks. And so the mythic then is an example of the circle and constructs how each civilization in the mythic is a microcosmic relation to the outer world. And the macrosphere, which Gebser thinks has since collapsed, of course, with the death of God and Darwin's theory, the Western psyche, and as such our relationship with the divine, with myth really the logic, the cutting, the triangular, if you'd like, as he discussed, penetrates those spheres, those immunizations of the macro. And so each sign that Gebser puts for each structure, as such with the civilization in the 20th century, where you have this sphere really busting and you have the contents of it laid out for us, you then have this sort of 20th century ideological wars and utopian visions that the Allies and the Germans, where you really have a metaphysical battle, as Spengler talked about, between the brothers of Europe that has no real answer, if you'd like, but it is just a war of blood. And so this for Gebser really is the summation of that collapse of Western man now being naked and at the mercy really of the simulacrum in the Baudrillardian sense, where we're always constructing these new simulations to contend with the collapse of that macrosphere, which once immunized and set boundaries for being put out into the bare naked life to put. And so Gebser says modernity is trying to contend with this collapse of the sphere, and out of those deficient modes attempting to create a new macro structure, which I think, as we've been looking through postmodernity lately, and now returned back to Gebser, I would say that, again, like much of the simulations, the postmodern task of coming out of these deficient modes to a greater understanding and trying to create a new macro structure. It certainly seems to be the case when it comes to hypermodernity. But nonetheless, interesting enough, Gebser really dismisses pop culture in his time, and I think this is somewhat of a shortfall for him, or we need to bracket off how he saw pop culture and its manifestations to him, because now I think in today's world, this pop culture, whatever we want to call the mass consumer society, the supplement for this vacancy has really taken a stranglehold over our creativity. And we think of accelerationism or this yearning for novelty. You think of Deleuze if you'd like. And so Gebser, of course, he really dismisses cinema or popular music in his time. And now Gebser really talks about the measure, mass, quality, or quantity, and the differences between what he would consider that vitalistic early stage of a structure in its efficient mode as compared to when it is in the late stage or the deficiency. And you can see how someone like Spengler here is really influential with how he sees high civilization and high culture falling into decadence. And so the independence of the growing reification of a world as consciousness becomes more sophisticated as it takes on more of the space and time aspects, becoming larger just as the magical was timeless and the cycle of history is introduced in the mythic. So now he's really starting to talk about the relationship of time that each structure has in its place in history, where the mental introduces space as a dimension and the integral balances with the mode of time. And then he has a really interesting association with breathing in and out, or the phenomenon of it applied really to his models here. You have this breathing character in the inhale and the exhale, where the magical is the outer directed. You have the mode of exhaling, which is directive. The mythical is contingent of the inhale, as it's directed to the soul, and the mental is the directive of nature in that exhale. The magic and the mental are outer, directing to the harnessing of nature. Think again of the manipulation of nature with spell casting, or of course with rationality and science and techniques. Where the integral is the character of inhaling and an inward understanding that renders really the diaphanous, which he would really call how we look at all these structures now in the integral stage, where we're looking at these past modes and appears in a transparency, renders the world of waking consciousness and makes deficient modes known to how it can divert the spirit. So in that sense, we have a greater knowledge to understand the deficient modes as they come and their relationship or lack of authenticity, if you'd like, towards the ever-present origin. As such, the ever-present origin is the single space of the whole of the archaic characteristic, and so the integral can see the ground of being, and the former renderings can be shown to the being of being itself and made visible, and the spiritual isn't this dualistic like the mental structure would have suggested, and ultimately becomes an and along with the mental, magic, and mythic. And so all the dualisms and then triadic logic thought can be placed within that integral structure. It all becomes a sort of and as opposed to polarity. each structure in the ground of being creates and exhausts or disposes of prior aspects as they mutate, mature, and wither. Again, that's that kind of German thought coming where, we're not in this sort of culminating of history as we're gradually going along and introducing aspects that are built upon older aspects. Some of these mature, wither, and are just forgotten as a new structure becomes efficient. And so gradually as it develops, it becomes further removed from the ground of being. This is, again, that characteristic of becoming a deficient mode here. And so each structure has a vitalism or moderate phase to the exhausted, immoderate from the qualitative to the aggravated deficiency. And so the energies of a culture in the springtime of civilization are of an intensity, and the quality shifting to the deficient coding or measurement, or the statistical aggregates, if you'd like, are of the extensive or the aggregating of land in the building of the empire, which loses that cultural energy. You can kind of, again, see that Spenglerian thought of, the vitality of a culture surrounding the city that sort of is the culmination of that vitalism, is also its sort of death or its forgetting of that culture. And there's an antagonism to that. And so in this sense, ontologically, we are still exposed without that spherical immunization. And we see with the struggles on an individual, the microcosm, if you'd like, of drugs, crime, nihilism, and just really abuse as we are left in this unprotected existence. And then he really discusses the evolution of religious phenomenology, where the magic then is of the grave and the images, idols, and rituals. The mythic structure then is of the gods, the symbols, and mysteries. The mental is of, one god, one, naturalistic law of nature as we would get on an intellectual plane. The Cartesian science and the face space, if you'd like. Monotheism is a prerequisite towards the mental structure, so going back to that model then, which is an emphasizing on the egocentric individual, and as such dogmatic thinking, either or, in the dualisms of the mythic structure of with or against. Magic then is of the ancestral figures or animals, and the tribal world in the magic is of the kin or the clanship. Again, think of that example I always talk about with, people being able to recite passages. They're a sort of encyclopedia onto themselves of these passed down traditions of their tribes. And so the social structure of mythic is parental or ancestral worship to the past orientation, and really predominantly a matriarchal fashion. And then in the mental, it's more future orientated, of the father and son, and really the characteristic of the Faustian of overcoming an environment, producing of techniques and gadgets. We see this sort of terms of service and this social attitude of never really getting your footing. There's always a new edition of some phone or some app that we must update, and if we don't, we get left behind rather quickly. And so this stage is similar to the child adulation of that mental structure as contrast for the magic and mythic, which is, of course, of the ancestor worship. And so the ancestors pronounce the symbols of technics or change as a perversion. The ancestor realm and worship doesn't orientate to the cartography of novel situations or techniques, such is the case with the West. And, with that, with the rise of high civilization, which goes from the cult of ancestors, and Gebser associates with the mythic, but perhaps the mythic and the magical structure is more towards the ancestor, as each god is associated with being a part of some technical construct, with Ninhursag or Inanna, which is the god of astrology, Nana, the moon, god builder of boats, and they have that sort of crescent-shaped moon. So you have a sort of assemblage of all of these different gods who have, reigns over a sort of technical aspect. And so each Sumerian with high civilization came to the earth with a new innovation or novelty that they reign over. And so the cult of the gods really enables man to construct the mirror of the macro vision of the divine then in that sense. And then Gebser says that the sexes shift from each structure, and the integral is to, of course, incorporate a balance of the patriarch and the matriarch. But I think as we've seen in contemporary times, you think of something like the Longhouse example, or where certainly in the New Age spheres, and as we've seen in internet culture, and perhaps even in pop culture on, TV series where, the patriarch is this sort of fumbling buffoon. Think of even something like Family Guy, which is an animation. Peter Griffin or Homer Simpson, they're always drunk idiots. And, I think you see that culturally, this sort of OnlyFans culture now of simping and diminishing the man, the masculine, and really offering a castration, and the cult of the goddess, which I think is really orientated now towards that. I'm not sure if I agree with Gebser, at least in the postmodern sense of bringing about balance, but and even if we were going to respectfully look at Baudrillard, he considered himself a sort of feminine philosophy and tied it really to mystery and that's sort of seductive. And again, that's sort of the elevation of women and feminism, whether or not you agree with those notions. We nonetheless see the devaluing of the man for, ultimately what's considered this longhouse in today's culture. But moving along then to chapter 5, which is really a discussion of time and its relationship to each structure. And so the space-time constitution of the structures offers 3 variations of time within the emergence of those new structures. For the magical, there's no concept of time, whereas with the mythical, Gebser accounts of magical temporal in the cavern night sky. The mental is triadic, where you have the past, present, and future. And so the space-timeless example of the magic as he goes on is as seen with the miracle at Lourdes in France in the 19th century. Even though this wasn't at the time of the magic, he nonetheless takes these miracles of healing seriously. And so in an interesting way, when he talks about prayer under the magic as a sonic that's addressed to the listening of the god, the activation of the magical structure of unity, all in present, effacing that individual, border, if you'd like, of the ego, and drops us down to the magical cavern world where all of the organs, in a way, acts like the body without organs. I was thinking about that a lot with Deleuze. And, prayer then has a resonance with others, and the resonance of the organs changes, and so those unhealthy organs are activated into this healing process, and really into the flows, if you'd like, of the body without organs. And so the act of prayer is similar to the yogi who accesses the deep dreamless sleep to the magical structure and can perform miracles because he lost that individual ego in the archaic ground of being. So you're shedding those sort of borders. And again, I think associating prayer here with how Gebser sees in the act of miracles as dipping into that magical structure, as how perhaps Deleuze in the postmodern world was trying to access these different structures as well. And the body without organs, in an interesting way, I think could be described here as what Gebser sees with prayer. And so the magical is the nighttime sky of a closed static cavern. And if we were to talk of the myth of Kronos, is the figure of the nighttime and separates, of course, with Kronos, he separates Uranus from Gaia and castrates his father, throws his testicles into the sea, and creates a polarity of the world parents. And out of paranoia, of course, Kronos devours the other Olympian gods before devouring a poison to then regurgitate out Zeus, who overthrows him into casting down of Hades, pushed below the earth. And so Gebser says that it's interesting with Zeus because he's not within the cavern but reigns on top of it. So you can see this sort of shifting here. And so the myth of the wakefulness over the magical structure and the transformation of Kel, he has these really interesting and I think totally fascinating usages of language and understanding of etymology that I think he's par excellence in this sorts of things. And so the transformation of the Kel word that had the magical structure word reference such as the CR prefix within Kronos is a transformation of the word prefix of Kel. So Keli, Clytemnestra, of the sheltering into the earth of the magical structure. Ker words goes from Kel words, and Gebser says, even in the mouth physiognomy of it, you open like a cavern to the closing of an L. The word itself opens and closes as it shifts from Ker to Kel. All references before are of that circular motion, and such as Kronos, who inherits the ancient cavern of unmoving and sets it all into motion. And so you're having the introduction really of the turning of motion, such as mythical temporicity and cyclical time. And of course you have the seasonal festivals, you have harvesting. So you have that introduction really of time then in that sense. And then moving to the triadic time, Gebser points to the Hebrew story of the prisoners as they're put with 3 horses, and there's blades that are ran over these prisoners with their cutting of them. And so Gebser shows that the day, or dies in Latin, in its etymology is the cutting of the night, da, as carving, just as the mental structure carves the mythical structures prior to them. And the horses in its trio is of the mythical sacrifice of the moon phases. So interesting enough that he sees that even the way day was made clear in Latin, that this is the notion of cutting of the night that I find very fascinating. And then moving to chapter 6, which is really the history of the soul and spirit and the structures of history of the idea, or the holy in the numinous, the Latin term of the divine power. So Gebser's point is that the structures mutate the relationships to the numinous changes. And so the capacity of the numinous beyond the civilization and out in nature becomes more limited as the intensities of consciousness increase in art. And so the higher conscious structure, starting with the mythical civilization, for one to experience the numinous, has to be done in the work of art. So think of, the aesthetic arrest with Schopenhauer, if you'd like, where you have a sort of civilization that calcifies, renders away experiencing the numinous out in the open, out in bare naked life, and is done through our civilization. And so as that dimension increases, as the experience of the numinous out in nature itself diminishes, and it goes into the realm of human culture. As the idea of the soul evolves, it simplifies, and gradually the complexity of the subtle body and its complexities of the microcosm of the soul. This parallels religious thinking of the animal figures of Egyptian mythology to the Hindu and Greek gods, where the Magian civilization is of one god or one spirit, and the dualism of the psyche and the pneuma. Plato says, of course, that we have multiple souls. We have the animal soul, the vegetable soul, and the rational soul that controls them. And then, of course, with the Hellenistic period, you have the soul as psyche as an opposition to soma. And so as we're tracing here, or Gebser is, you see fewer souls and deities until with the Magian of one spirit, one devil, all the way up until Descartes with the soul as simply thinking then. And so the soul separates from body, and all consciousness is compiled to the ability to think. this is a diminishing of the conscious structures in nature to the numinous world, as well as that inward relationship. So in this very dense tracing here, he's pointing out that the microcosm and macrocosm over time, as we've calcified and developed the ego, if you'd like, we form these sort of logical dualisms and reduce down the relationship of the divine or the numinous and the relationship of the soul down to thinking, if you'd like. And then in the second half of the chapter on the phenomenon of soul and spirit, the soul has two poles or two polarities of life and death. And so all the ideas of the mythic structure are like the yin and yang and the polarities of the circular heavens and square earth. And in Chinese religion of the Han and Po soul, Han is of the breath and intellect to the heaven, and the Po soul is of circulation, the genitals, and the primal urge. So you have the death pole is the afterlife, such as the bird, Greek, such as the harpies and the sirens, who contrast the music of life and soul, invigoration. The poet, the siren song, is of death. The soul as dove or bird, and of course this is archetypical in ancient civilizations, and in its death, the soul links with air and life. Soul of water, where water represents vitality. Of course, everything comes from water or life. And with Thales, you have the claim that all things are water, the watery abyss that is akin to vitalism, from which all comes from. And in fact, the word abyss comes from the Babylonian word abzu. And so you have these vowels of a or a, aqua, valser, or absu, or the abyss. These are water words that they associate with the ah sound. The German word soul, Seele, has an etymology relation to die seen or see for the English translation, and has a relationship between water and the living soul. The life soul, water, and air soul has a sort of death and a polarity in history. Spirit, then, is the soul association with the moon, which revives spirit association with the sun soul. And so Jungians and the other really interpretations get, again, sort of in that rational sense, they reduce down the moon and sun dialectic wrong insofar that it's far too dogmatic about applying the masculine and feminine to the sun and moon, and the relationship applied to cultural convention is really more of the key than any set standard between the two. So you can muddy the waters really with comparing moon and the sun and their association with masculine and feminine. And I think the key really is more in with that difference, trying to articulate that difference through the cultural convention. Freud discovers the magical structure because the instincts and vitality is to do with the magical structure, which is the case of his theory of the drives. You have that sort of primalism there, where Jung discovery is of the mythical structure in the images of studying. Einstein's theory in a Unitarian theory of a magical structure. Niels Bohr then has, with his complementary principle, reactivates that mythical structure. And so his problem with psychology to the conscious and unconscious as a rationalistic dualism, and only contents with the reductionary ideas of consciousness being either or and not to these differing degrees of a sort of Leibniz monadology, if you'd like, or the degrees of being, as compared to just having either conscious or unconscious. And so moving along to chapter 7, these previous forms of realization and thought. And so the rational Copernican 3D construction is a parallel to the innovation of the collapse of the material city barrier by the use of the cannons and the gunpowder with the Ottomans, who get that from the Chinese. And so in the 17th and 18th century, at the same time, the collapse of the metaphysical barrier begins, in the bare naked life in the open world, and his own experience begins with Descartes as a reduction of soul and consciousness to I think. And so philosophically, in the history of ideas, we would say that, philosophy since has a categorical dispute of trying to form a new macrocosmic social sphere and a sort of immunization against the enduring of the simulacrum, if you'd like, or at least trying to overcome it. And so thought proceeds in accordance to those structures one finds themselves in, or at least that's what Gebser is really trying to get for us. And so magical thought in the primitive man as a vital experience, whereas with the rational man, he thinks of the world. Think of the will, if you'd like. And so the mythical is thought of or being in a thought container, experiencing the world in a concrete way, which of course is different from the other two. And then he goes to oceanic thinking, which I think is interesting, with proper thinking of the mythical structure in the way thinking is done for the mythical circle of the serpent biting its own tail, or the open-ended circle of end and the beginning in a cycle. And so oceanic thought, because with the ancient Greeks of oceanos, of the earth, bounding serpent with the earth, of course, being the midpoint. And so Heraclitus then, in his use of this cyclical pattern then, in his metaphor of the beginning and end being woven into the cycle itself. So in his example, he says souls are A, becoming water, the B proposition, but water becomes earth. With the introduction of earth, you have the C, but from earth comes back to water, the B statement, and from water to the soul, which of course goes back to A. And then you see in Christianity in the Gospels with John, in the beginning was Logos, Logos with God, and God was the Logos. And Logos was with the beginning with God, and ends where it begins. In the beginning was Logos, and in the end the Logos was in the beginning with God. And so this is an example of that reoccurrence of the mythical consciousness of logical circularity. But they call the pyramidal thought, which is perspectival beginning with Plato and Socrates. The pyramid is efficient in its strength, and when we get to the deficient mode of the Renaissance, is really the introduction of the Heideggerian and framing, where everything is just quantitative. There's no qualitative studying anymore, and so that would be the deficient mode. Socrates as the man example of the pyramid thinking, where you start with all creatures are at the top, and then you go from there to the lower level of mortal or immortal, and then under mortal you have the subcategory of Socrates. And so we have men and animals under the mortal category, which of course leads to Socrates. But this is of course cutting that mythical circle where the final statement doesn't return back to the original proposition, and it doesn't go all the way ascending to all men, but is triangular to that second reference. And so the cutting of the circle of the family or kin and blood of the mythic world, which this kind of goes into an explanation of why Plato would ban poets in the utterance in the tribal encyclopedia stored in the memory that you have hand down, that sayings in place of individual thought. This is why Socrates was against conventions and that use of that mythical structure, because he's the birth of the mental. He wants people to think in an individualistic way, or detribalize and cut them out of that tribal convention of blood, of that mythical structure then. And so in the integral structure, you have Pascal's statement that he points to, that you would not seek me if you had not found me. And so you're taking that formulation and into a paradox, which takes that perspectival space of the pyramidal thinking in the base of the eyes of the person to the horizon of a single point of view. So this is getting into perspectivalism now. But in this mutation here, the paradox, though, crosses and creates another triangle because of the hidden rational logic, such as, again, with Pascal's statement, if you had not found me, you would have not sought for me. And so there's a rationality underneath that original paradox of similar fashion to two triangles meeting, and subverts that single point of view, or the vanishing point of rational thought, because again, they go into this sort of X way now. And so you're having the move of that mental face space in the integral as going beyond just rational propositions, and the use of the rationality of the flipping of the mind into the irrational mind state, such as Gebser was a big fan of Zen Buddhism, if you might have caught up on. And so the integrating of that other side, or the inverse mirror image beyond the walls of rational thought. And so rational man has a connection to the rational walling away from nature in its closed borders, and the punching of that barrier in the aperspectival structure, or the creation of a door, if you'd like, to that other side beyond rationality. And so Gebser calls this specifically Varetian, as seeing through the logic of paradox to the other side, and this will link the elements of the mythic and magical to that rational structure. And so he then posits how you go from the shift from left to right. And of course this begins with the overhaul in France with the revolution. And so the left is to bring balance to the right. And of course we saw since then in postmodernity the rise of women and the calls for feminism and equality. They are the inferior now who looks to balance. There's the association of women with the sinister path of the woman moving into balance. And then he actually gives praise here somewhat to Freud and Jung of the conscious and unconscious as a balancing act in that integral stage. And so he finishes really volume 1 with chapter 8 in his conclusions, and of course the foundations of the Aperspectival world, which we'll of course get into as he does. And so Gebser, in the integral thinking and the process of the awakening of the movement from the lunar and solar cults of nighttime to daytime. The lunar calendar, if you look through history, is older than that solar calendar. And so the Egyptians discover the lunar to solar gradually from the Old Kingdom to the Third Dynasty, where the first pyramids are laid north to south, and the access, or there's an entry point for the pharaoh to join with the pole star. And then you have with the early cults of the bull being linked to the nighttime moon, which gives way to that Fourth Dynasty and goes in an east to west axis. So now you have a shift of following the trajectory of the sun, the greeting of the rising sun, and the shift to solar, to have the cult of the Ray with the Fourth Dynasty. And then with the Fifth Dynasty, you have the rise of those sun temples. And then when we would look at the Hindu cultures, you go from the north to the south. You have the Maharaja, which is of course the lunar, and then the first text to the Ramayana, which is of course the solar text, and is positioned to the south with Sri Lanka. And so this is an interesting way of noticing how, all of these high civilizations have this interesting relationship of, starting off with these lunar cults and then shifting to the solar cults. In fact, you would see this with the Chinese as well, with their dynasties. And I think that's very interesting. You may not necessarily agree with all of Gebser's categories or representations, if you'd like, or even diagnosis, but I think the main point here is, history does move in this sort of fashion. You do see all of these high civilizations go from, moon cults to sun cults. And, why is that? Why do we have these shifts or mutations in human culture? And I think that is really the fascinating and an interesting point of really getting at the ever-present origin. And so to conclude this volume on Gebser, we want to discuss how he sees the organs as localizations in the aspect of the soul in each structure. And so if we start with the magical, you have semen and blood. In the mythical, you have this shift from the genitals to the soul of the heart. In ancient Egypt, the heart was the only organ that's left behind because they need the heart to be judged in the scale of the afterlife in their myths. Were the Greeks, such as Homer, the heart is the center of consciousness. Homer is also blind. You have the idea of the third eye, the awakening, if you'd like, where the eyes themselves might not see the subtleties beyond just the material existence itself. But then nonetheless, with the mental structure, you have the seating of the soul with the brain and the pineal gland as really the seat of the mind, of consciousness, and that's really the rational organ. But then the integral is not just bound to the eye, but is of the use of the technics, I think. Now, of course, Gebser doesn't say this, but it's always been supplemented, I think, in reading since then, where you're beginning to see the return of these different structures, but they're done with the use of the acoustic global technologies, where you have a sort of extension of the body, the extension of the soul, if you'd like, to now the light speed technologies, the simulacrum, the hypermodern experience we find ourselves in today. And so in that sense, I think Gebser, in his, of course, time, just as how with Spengler, we would say that, he maybe missed some of the aspects of what the modern world was trying to do as it was happening to him. And then Gebser picks up on that for aperspectivity. We could perhaps see a similar way to how Gebser dismissed pop culture, dismissed the coming of these light speed technologies that perhaps would convey the structures in a different way or go beyond what the modern world he thought was ultimately still nonetheless a sort of apex of history. He clearly sees the integral as, trying to bring balance to all of, history in that sense, even though he, disparages the idea of culminating history in a sort of linear way. Nonetheless, the way the integral kind of plays out in his thought lends itself to the interpreting that, we're supposed to achieve a sort of balance by a greater understanding of the deficiency of all of these structures, or how they had an efficient period. And as we'll get to volume 2, which is the retrieval of the integral structure and modernity in this sphere of, again, highbrow European culture. So in that sense, maybe he misses the mark of understanding where, human culture was heading towards in post-modernity, as we've looked at on the channel now. But nonetheless, his historicism, I think, is very valuable, and how he eventually builds towards an archaeology in the second volume of the integral structure is fascinating and filled with rich ideas, I think, even if not all of them really held up towards the light of postmodernity. There's still a lot of value to be gained in this text or texts. And if you guys like this video and like this series, please consider liking, comment, and subscribing as we get into volume 2 in the Aperspectival world.